At my son's wedding, my daughter-in-law shouted in my face, "Know your place, this isn't where you belong." Then she smashed a cake into my face in front of all the guests. What she didn't know, as the frosting dripped down my suit, was that I didn't react. I calmly took out my phone and made a call. That call would make her regret it for the rest of her life. Hello everyone, thanks for being here. Like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. If you were in my position at that moment, would you react immediately or stay silent like I did? Note, this is a fictional story, created to deliver meaningful and insightful perspectives for viewers. The rhythmic rattling of my 12-year-old Honda Civic's engine was an insult to the manicured silence of Palm Beach, a mechanical cough that made every head in the valet line turn with a mixture of pity and annoyance. I could feel the vibrations through the worn leather of the steering wheel, a gritty sensation that matched the resolve hardening in my chest. Thane Garrison, a 68-year-old retired hospital general counsel, pulled my modest sedan into the circular driveway of the breakers, feeling like a single gray stone dropped into a sea of polished diamonds. To my left, a cherry-red Ferrari shimmered under the golden hour sun. To my right, a matte black Lamborghini sat with its doors winged open like a predatory bird. I adjusted my tie, checking the reflection in the rearview mirror. My $48 Kohl's suit was ironed to a sharp, defiant edge, clean and functional. It was a garment designed for a man who values the law of logic over the law of luxury. Though in this driveway, it might as well have been a suit of rags. Have you ever noticed how the wealthy use silence as a weapon? It is not that they do not see you. It is that they have practiced looking through you until you become transparent. As I sat there, the engine giving one final shuddering gasp before dying, I watched the parade of the elite. I knew the secrets behind those designer sunglasses. I knew which of these shining pillars of the community were currently under investigation for Medicare fraud and whose offshore accounts were hemorrhaging cash. My budget appearance was a choice, a tactical invisibility I had maintained for decades, while I managed a $2.9 million legal department. The young valet approached my window. He was a boy who couldn't have been older than 22, his silk vest probably costing more than my first car. He didn't even bother with a professional smile. Instead, he looked at the duct tape holding my side mirror in place with the kind of pity usually reserved for roadkill. "Sir, I think you have taken a wrong turn," he said, his voice dripping with a condescension that was both practiced and pathetic. "Deliveries and service staff are around the back near the loading docks." I didn't flinch. I simply turned my head, meeting his gaze with the steady clinical stare I used to give opposing counsel during million-dollar depositions. "I am not here to deliver son. I am here for the Sterling Garrison wedding. I am the groom's father." The boy's face didn't just fall, it eroded. The sneer vanished, replaced by a frantic pale mask of terror. "Oh, Mr. Garrison, I am so sorry, sir. Right this way." He took my keys with 2 fingers, handling them as if they were contaminated with a viral load, while he signaled frantically for another attendant. He didn't know he was holding the keys to his own unemployment, or at the very least a very long lesson in basic human decency. I stepped out of the car, the Florida heat shimmering off the asphalt, clashing with the cold jasmine-scented air blowing out from the hotel lobby. Just as the valet began to reverse my Honda into the shadows, a black Mercedes Pullman pulled up directly behind where I had stood. I didn't need to see the driver to know who it was. The personalized plates read HOS-EXEC. I knew that car. I knew the man inside. Leland Norcross, a senior member of the hospital board, with a face like weathered granite and a conscience I had spent decades testing. Leland was the kind of man who believed that a title was a substitute for a soul. I tilted my head slightly, allowing the shadow of the hotel's portico to obscure my face. I wasn't ready to be recognized yet, not while I was still wearing the outsider's uniform. I watched from the corner of my eye as Leland stepped out, his $5,000 tuxedo fitting him like a second skin. He didn't even glance at the valet. He just tossed his keys into the air, expecting them to be caught. "Make sure you park it somewhere out of sight." "Yeah," Leland barked, gesturing vaguely toward the line of luxury vehicles. "Don't want to ruin the aesthetic of the wedding photos with any budget eyesores." The valet nodded feverishly, casting a panicked look back at my Honda. The Breakers was a fortress of gold leaf and ego, but every fortress has a foundation of sand, and I was the one who knew exactly where the tide was coming in. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against my phone. I wasn't just ignoring the insults, I was actively recording. I had already noted the license plates of the 3 cars ahead of me, cataloging the names of the men who would soon be sitting across from me in a much smaller, much less comfortable room. These were the people who considered me a liability for the Sterling family's image. They wanted me in the corner out of the light so they could continue the charade of their own perfection. As I moved toward the gold-leafed entrance, the sound of the valet's dismissive laughter echoed behind me, a sharp, ugly sound that cut through the ocean breeze. He thought he had seen the last of the man in the cheap suit. He thought I was just a ghost, haunting my son's upward mobility. He was wrong. I was the architect of the very world they were trying to build, and tonight I was going to show them exactly what happens when you try to build a dynasty on a lie. As I stepped onto the marble floor of the lobby, I realized the valet's mockery was only the appetizer. The Sterling family was preparing a main course of humiliation that would change our lives forever. The lobby of the Breakers didn't just smell like expensive jasmine, it smelled like the kind of money that buys the right to be cruel without consequence. As I stepped onto the marble floor, my 12-year-old Honda Civic and the valet's dismissive laughter were already fading echoes in the humid Florida night. I moved toward the coat check, acutely aware that the Sterling family was preparing a main course of humiliation that would change our lives forever. My mission was simple: remain the observer. I had spent 40 years in the belly of a hospital system, navigating the shark-infested waters of hospital boards and surgical negligence suits. I knew how to wait for the right moment to strike. I approached the coat check counter, where a young woman stood with a posture so rigid it looked painful. She was the coat check attendant, a woman whose pinched expression suggested she was smelling something sour, and she looked at my $48 Kohl's jacket with the clinical disdain of a lab technician handling a biohazard. I extended the garment toward her. She didn't reach for it. She stared at the sleeve as if expecting a moth to crawl out and contaminate her station. "Is this all, sir?" she asked, her voice a thin wire of disbelief. "It's clean pressed and paid for. That should be enough for the hook." I replied, my voice steady and devoid of the irritation she was clearly trying to provoke. She finally took the jacket, using only the tips of her thumb and forefinger to lift it, a silent performance of disgust that I noted with the detached precision of a legal auditor. As she turned to hang it, my eyes caught a glimpse of a document resting on her side table. It was a printed memo titled "Visual Standards for High-Tier Events." My gaze scanned the bullet points with practiced speed. One specific line stood out: off-brand or worn attire to be kept in rear storage away from guest sightlines. I almost smiled. They weren't just judging me. They had codified their prejudice into a corporate policy. Dignity doesn't have a price tag, but it certainly has a target on its back in Palm Beach. I stepped away from the counter, adjusting the cuffs of my shirt. I didn't need the jacket to feel complete. I began to move through the lobby toward the grand ballroom, my internal risk manager taking the wheel. I instinctively mapped the exits, noting the heavy oak doors to the terrace and the service corridors tucked behind the velvet tapestries. I identified the security placements: 3 men in discreet earpieces near the elevators, 2 more by the ballroom entrance. I noticed the subtle hierarchy of the crowd. The real power didn't shout, it whispered in the corners. The ones who were truly dangerous were the ones who, like me, were watching more than they were talking. Have you ever felt the weight of a room trying to erase you? It's not a heavy pressure, it's a hollow one, like oxygen being sucked out of a vacuum. I felt that void as I reached the entrance to the ballroom. A server in a tuxedo that cost more than my first 2 cars together stepped into my path, his hand raised in a polite but firm barrier. "Sir, your invitation." I produced the card. His eyes flickered from the elegant script to my face, then down to my lack of a designer label. "Ah, yes, Mr. Garrison. Table 12 is right this way, sir. Tucked away for privacy." Privacy. "Or so I don't ruin the background of the live stream?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He didn't respond, merely gesturing toward the far, dim corner of the room. I followed him past table 1, which was a dizzying display of $18,000 floral arrangements and crystal that caught the light like trapped stars. The Sterlings were there, a golden circle of surgeons and socialites, their laughter ringing out like a challenge. I was led further and further away until the music of the string quartet became a muffled hum. Table 12 was not just at the back. It was positioned behind a massive floor-to-ceiling marble pillar. The stone was cold and unyielding, a structural support that effectively cut off my view of the altar and the head table entirely. I was in exile in the middle of my own son's wedding. The marble pillar wasn't just a structural support. It was a stone middle finger from the Sterling family, permanently casting me into the shadows of my own son's wedding. I pulled out the chair, the legs scraping against the floor, with a sound that felt too loud in the curated silence of the lower tables. As I sat down, I reached for the seating card placed in front of my setting. I had spent years reviewing documents for subtle discrepancies, and this one screamed at me. The other cards at the nearby tables were printed in an elegant embossed calligraphy. Mine was different. It was a rushed handwritten replacement, the ink still slightly smeared. This wasn't an original plan. I had been moved. I had been a Table 1 guest until the very last second, until someone likely Briar or her mother realized that my presence would be a blemish on their perfect aesthetic. I sat down in the drafty corner, my view blocked by 1,000,000 pounds of stone, and reached into my pocket for the one thing they forgot. I still possessed a memory for every name on the guest list. I didn't need to see the head table to know what was happening there. I knew the players, I knew their debts. And most importantly, I knew that a foundation built on the exclusion of truth is a foundation that cannot hold. I adjusted my tie one last time, my fingers steady. The game had officially begun, and while they thought they had hidden me away, they had actually given me the perfect vantage point to watch their world crumble. I leaned back, my spine straight, and waited for the first direct insult to arrive. I knew it wouldn't be long. I felt her presence before I saw her, a wave of expensive cloying perfume that acted as a herald for the woman who considered herself the Queen of Palm Beach. It was a suffocating jasmine scent, the kind that didn't just linger in the air, but seemed to claim ownership of the oxygen itself. I sat down in the drafty corner of table 12, my view blocked by 1,000,000 pounds of stone, and reached into my pocket for the one thing they forgot. I still possessed a memory for every name on the guest list. I didn't look up immediately. Instead, I focused on the table setting in front of me. The silverware was heavy, real silver, and the crystal glass felt fragile in my work-worn hands. I began a mental audit of the room, a habit from 40 years of hospital management, where every decimal point represented a life or a lawsuit. I cataloged the $18,000 floral arrangements, white orchids and calla lilies that were already beginning to wilt under the intense ballroom lights. I looked at the $300 a bottle champagne being poured at the tables around the pillar, contrasting this visible opulence with the secret bankruptcy I knew the Sterlings had filed months ago. It was a spectacular house of cards built on borrowed time and the life insurance money of my own late wife Helena. She wore her arrogance like a coat of armor, unaware that the metal was already rusting from the salt of her own lies. I could hear the sharp rhythmic click of heels on the marble growing louder until they stopped precisely 3 feet from my chair. I finally looked up. Clementine Sterling, a 54-year-old surgeon with a practiced socialite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, approached with a rustle of silk that sounded like a warning. She was the mother of the bride, the matriarch of a dynasty that existed mostly in her own imagination. "Thane dear, we are so glad you could find your seat," she said, her voice as sharp and sterile as a scalpel. "It is so important to have a quiet place for reflection away from the bustle of the medical elite." I leaned back, my spine brushing against the cold marble of the pillar. "I have spent 40 years in hospitals, Clementine. I am quite used to the view from the sidelines." My voice was calm, the pitch perfectly modulated to show neither irritation nor submission. Her smile faltered for a microsecond, a glitch in the software of her social programming, before she smoothed it over. She began a lecture that was ostensibly a welcome, but was actually a boundary-setting exercise. She spoke of the particular social obligations that came with joining a family like hers, the charity galas, the hospital board, functions, the country club expectations. She used coded language to describe my background as practical and essential, making it clear that while I was the father of the groom, I was expected to remain in the periphery of my son's new, elevated life. Believe me when I tell you that a woman who has spent her life holding a scalpel knows exactly where to cut if she wants you to bleed out slowly. I watched her closely, my eyes performing the same diagnostic scan I used during legal depositions. I wasn't just listening to her words. I was checking her pulse at the hollow of her throat and the slight dilation of her pupils. She was terrified. Despite the designer gown and the diamonds, she was a woman standing on the edge of a cliff. Hospital work is so vital. She continued, her condescension doubling down. It is the oil that keeps the machine running even if it never touches the actual patient. I took a sip of the cheap complimentary ginger ale the server had left for me. Sometimes the oil is the only thing preventing the machine from a total catastrophic seizure, I replied. She didn't like that. She shifted her weight, and for the first time, her socialite mask slipped enough for me to see the raw nerves underneath. She questioned my ability to understand the billable pressures and legal complexities of their world, referring to my career as institutional support. She implied I was little more than a high-level clerk who happened to have a law degree. As she flaunted her surgeon status, I visualized the foreclosure lien currently sitting on her oceanfront estate, a document I had pulled from the public records 3 nights ago. She thought she was the surgeon. She didn't realize she was the specimen. I sat there in the shadow of that massive pillar, the cold, damp feeling of the condensation on the champagne bucket nearby pressing against my arm. Clementine leaned in, her voice dropping to a confidential whisper that carried more venom than a snake bite. She told me that Milo had specifically requested that she speak to me about keeping a low profile tonight. She claimed my son didn't want any awkwardness with the senior partners from Briar's firm. The betrayal was a dull ache in my chest, deeper than the sting of Clementine's words. My son hadn't just moved my table, he had authorized my silencing. As Clementine turned her back on me, her designer gown shimmering in the light like the scales of a predatory fish, I noticed the one detail she had missed. There was a tiny frantic tremor in her left hand as she reached for a glass of champagne from a passing tray. It was a telesign of a house of cards that was one breath away from falling. She walked away, leaving me in the darkness of the pillar's shadow, thinking she had successfully put the budget father in his place. She had no idea that I was counting the seconds until the toast began. The essential support was about to pull the plug on the entire operation. As the music shifted and the first course was served, I saw Briar Sterling approaching from the other side of the room, her eyes fixed on table 12. The bride was coming to deliver the billable hour blow, and I was more than ready to receive it. The sharp click of designer stilettos against the marble announced Briar before she even stepped into my shadow. And the way she adjusted her silk train suggested she was approaching a crime scene rather than her father-in-law. I remained seated behind the massive stone pillar of table 12, my posture as unyielding as the granite I had leaned against for 40 years of hospital administration. As Clementine turned her back on me, her designer gown shimmering in the light, I noticed the one detail she had missed: a tiny, frantic tremor in her left hand that told me her house of cards was one breath away from falling. But before I could process the surgeon's frailty, the bride arrived to deliver the secondary strike. Briar Sterling, the 28-year-old bride and Yale-educated corporate attorney, glided through the reception in a designer gown that cost more than most people's annual salary, her eyes already dismissing her father-in-law. She looked at my Kohl's suit with a cold, judgmental blue that made the Florida air conditioning feel warm by comparison. "Thane, you look comfortable back here," she said, her voice dripping with a calculated metallic edge. "I suppose the quiet suits your pace of life." "My pace is steady, Briar," I replied, my voice perfectly modulated. "It is the only way to catch the things people drop when they are rushing." Have you ever seen a person so blinded by their own billable rate that they cannot see the person paying for the lights? Briar didn't just ignore my comment. She physically recoiled from it as if the very air around table 12 were contaminated with common sense. From my isolated vantage point, I could see Dr. Miller and a group of surgeons laughing at a table nearby. I caught fragments of their conversation jokes about peasant stock and budget guests, and I noted the doctor. Miller was wearing a Patek Philippe that cost more than the hospital wing I once authorized for renovation. Briar glanced toward them, her eyes hungry for their approval. She didn't realize that I knew exactly which of those men were under internal investigation for kickbacks. She also didn't realize that Leland Norcross, the board member in the black Mercedes, was currently watching our interaction with a confusion that bordered on panic. Leland was her biggest client at the firm, and he was seeing his elite attorney speak to the man who held his professional life in a digital folder. Briar leaned closer, her expensive sharp perfume clashing with the faint smell of the cooling sea bass on a nearby tray. "In my world, if you aren't rushing, you aren't billing," she hissed. "My time is literally worth $850 an hour. This entire table's combined income wouldn't cover my morning coffee run." I watched her calculating the distance between her ego and her reality. She was measuring my worth in hours. I was measuring hers in lies. She began to mock my semi-retirement, suggesting that working for a hospital system was merely a refuge for lawyers who could not hack it in the real litigation of a firm. She was the future of the Sterling legacy, she claimed, while I was a relic of the public sector. Her arrogance was a designer silk noose, and she was tightening the knot with every boast about her Harvard law degree. Milo needs to be around winners now, Thane. Real law, real money. Your institutional support just doesn't fit the brand we are building. I felt a surge of righteous indignation, but I kept it locked behind a mask of clinical detachment. A brand is just a name on a box, Briar. It is what is inside that determines if it holds weight. She laughed a sound like glass breaking on stone. Inside the box is success, something you managed to avoid by hiding in a hospital basement for 3 decades. I fingered the hospital board folder on my phone, knowing her firm was currently bidding for a $15 million contract that I had the power to veto with a single paragraph. She thought she was the one in control. She thought she was the one with the power. Have you ever noticed how the elite use their billable hours as a shield? Never realizing that the shield is made of paper, Briar leaned in even further, her voice dropping to a poisonous whisper that cut deeper than any scalpel. She told me exactly why Milo hadn't looked me in the eye all night. It wasn't just the shame of my car or my suit. She claimed that Milo had agreed to her career plan, which involved systematically cutting ties with my low-tier legal connections to secure his junior partnership. He is moving up, Thane. He is marrying up, and that means leaving the weight behind. The betrayal was a cold weight in my chest, a physical pressure that almost made me gasp. My own son had traded our history for a seat at a table that was currently defaulting on its mortgage. Briar straightened up, smoothing her gown with a triumphant smile. Don't take it personally. It is just business, the Sterling way. She turned and walked away, her heels clicking a rhythmic victory march on the marble, leaving me in the shadow of the pillar. I watched her go, realizing that the silver locket I had seen earlier around her neck was glinting in the light. It was Helena's locket, the one that had gone missing from room 314. As I sat there, the weight of her insults settling around me like dust, I realized the secret, she whispered, wasn't just about Milo's career. It was a secret that could destroy the Garrison name forever if I didn't act. I closed my eyes, and for a moment the ballroom's glitter faded, replaced by a memory of a promise made in a very different room. The bill was coming due, and I was the only one who knew how to collect. I closed my eyes, and for a moment the clinking of crystal and the pretentious laughter of Palm Beach faded, replaced by the rhythmic mechanical wheeze of an oxygen concentrator in room 314. The transition was so visceral that I could almost smell the sharp clinical tang of antiseptic and the heavy scent of stale coffee that had become the background of my life in 2018. Helena Garrison, my wife of 40 years, lay in the pale light of that hospice wing, her strength diminished, but her spirit as sharp as the winter stars she always loved. In my memory, the green light of the heart monitor flickered against the sterile white walls, a metronome for a life that was slowly winding down. I felt the dry, papery texture of her hand in mine, a touch that carried more weight than all the gold in this ballroom. She had spoken so often of a young volunteer during those final weeks, a law student who would sit by her bed and talk about the world outside. Helena told me, the girl treated her like a human being, rather than just another patient number or a liability to be managed. Thane, she had whispered, her voice a fragile rasp. Promise me. Don't let the insurance money just sit in a bank gathering dust. Find the ones with heart. Find the people who remember the soul behind the case file. I had squeezed her hand, swallowing the lump in my throat that felt like a stone. I promise, Helena, I will find them. I will make sure the Garrison name stands for exactly what you believe in. Memory is a double-edged sword. It provides the warmth of a hearth in a cold room, but it also sharpens the edges of the betrayal you are currently enduring. I snapped my eyes open to the icy shock of the ballroom's high-velocity air conditioning, a temperature designed to keep socialites from perspiring in their silk, but one that felt like a morgue to me. I looked across the floor at Briar, who was laughing with a group of young associates. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. She was the girl. Briar was the kind soul Helena had praised in her final days. But the girl my wife saw had been completely subsumed by the Sterling family's toxic elitism, buried under layers of designer labels and billable hour requirements. I reached into the pocket of my Kohl's suit and felt the folded edge of the scholarship fund's charter. It was a silent weapon Helena had unknowingly helped me forge. I had created that fund to honor her wish, intending it for people like the girl she described. How do you tell a dying woman that the good soul she sees in a stranger is just a mask waiting for the right price to be dropped? I watched Briar tilt her head, the light from the chandeliers catching on a silver object around her neck. My heart gave a painful rhythmic thud against my ribs. It was a silver locket, intricate and slightly tarnished at the hinges. I knew that locket. I had spent 40 years watching Helena wear it, and I had spent 6 years wondering where it had gone after she passed. I remembered the day the nurses searched the room, the day I thought it had simply been lost in the chaos of the transition. The locket wasn't lost. It was looted. Breyer hadn't just volunteered. She had treated my wife's bedside like a showroom for petty theft. My mathematical mind began to process the variables. The probability of Breyer happening upon an identical vintage piece was statistically insignificant. She had taken it while Helena was sleeping, or perhaps after she had drawn her last breath. My grief, which I had kept under clinical control for so long, began to boil into a cold-focused, protective rage. I wasn't just observing a wedding anymore. I was documenting a crime scene. I realized I wasn't the only one watching. Leland Norcross, a senior member of the hospital board, with a face like weathered granite and a conscience I'd spent decades testing, sat 3 tables away, clutching his glass too tight. He looked troubled, his gaze darting between me and Breyer with a frantic energy. He was the man I had investigated for the procurement scandal, the man who knew I held a digital folder that could end his career with a single click. I remembered the poisonous whisper Breyer had used just moments ago, telling me that Milo had agreed to cut me off. I looked at Leland, trying to read the micro-expressions on his face. He didn't look triumphant. He looked like a man who had been forced to sign a confession. I realized that Norcross might be the key to understanding if my son was a victim of the Sterlings or a willing participant in my erasure. Leland caught my eye. Usually he would look away or offer a smug, distant nod. Tonight his eyes were wide, pleading. He didn't speak, but he leaned forward slightly, his lips moving in a silent, desperate shape. He mouthed the words, "I'm sorry," before turning his head toward the bar, his hand shaking so much that his bourbon sloshed over the rim of the glass. The apology hung in the air like a death sentence, a heavy, suffocant confirmation of the secret Breyer had hinted at. It wasn't just a career plan. It was a deal made with the hospital board to save the Sterling practice by sacrificing the one man who knew where the bodies were buried. As I saw Milo approaching the alcove for our scheduled private meeting, my stomach twisted into a knot of cold lead. I realized the locket wasn't the only thing Breyer had stolen from my family. She had stolen my son's spine, and she was currently using it to prop up her own collapsing dynasty. Milo stepped into the alcove shadow, his grandfather's vintage tuxedo, fitting him like a costume he was desperate to shed. His eyes darting toward the ballroom, as if he were being watched by his own conscience. The smell of old mothballs and heavy starch from the wool clung to him, a scent of a history he was trying to bury under the jasmine-scented expectations of Palm Beach. Milo Garrison, my 29-year-old son, and a junior attorney stood before me in the dim light of the alcove, but the man I raised seemed to have been replaced by a stranger with a tight, nervous smile and a dry, frantic rasp in his breathing. Through the sheer gauzy curtains of the alcove, I could see Breyer laughing with a circle of senior board members in the distance. The silver locket around her neck caught the ballroom lights glinting like a cold, accusing eye. I didn't need a magnifying glass to confirm what my heart already knew. It was the exact same locket Helena had worn for 40 years, the one that disappeared from her bedside locker the day she died in room 314. I realized then that Breyer's celebrated kindness as a hospice volunteer hadn't been an act of mercy. It had been a calculated cover for theft. The realization brought a taste of bile and cold ginger ale to the back of my throat, but I kept my face as immobile as a deposition transcript. I looked at the locket again and saw a detail that Breyer must have deemed beneath her notice. A tiny sliver of a photograph was still visible at the hinge. It was Helena's wedding photo. Breyer hadn't even bothered to remove it, assuming I would never be allowed close enough to look. "Dad, you have to stop this," Milo said, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper to compete with the muffled booming bass of the reception music vibrating through the walls. "Your attitude is making Breyer uncomfortable. Her mother noticed you staring from behind that pillar." I looked at my son, noting the way his eyes avoided mine. "I am staring at the truth, Milo. Tell me, does she respect our family, or are we just a box she needs to check for her community engagement credits?" He let out a sharp, frustrated breath. "You don't understand. I'm finally playing in a different league. Marrying Breyer isn't just about love. It's about finally belonging to something bigger than a small-town hospital legal department." He used the phrase "marrying up" without even flinching, as if he were discussing a real estate transaction rather than a life partner. He was standing right in front of me, but he was 1,000 miles away, drifting on a tide of borrowed prestige and hollow promises. Belonging to what, Milo? I asked, my voice dangerously calm. A family that treats your father like a stain on the upholstery. A woman who wears your mother's stolen jewelry as a trophy of her social climbing. Milo's face flushed a deep, angry red. It's not like that. She just wants to give me the opportunities you couldn't. You've spent 30 years in the same office, Dad. That's not a legacy, that's a rut. I'm becoming a real lawyer. I felt the heartbreak not as a sharp pain, but as a hollow, aching coldness. My rut had funded his Ivy League tuition and his designer lifestyle. At what point does a son stop being an extension of your legacy and start being the architect of your destruction? I leaned forward, the shadows of the alcove deepening the lines on my face. Then explain Leland Norcross to me, Milo. Why did a senior board member mouth an apology to me like he was watching a funeral? Milo's face went from red to a sickly translucent pale. He stepped back, his hand trembling as he adjusted his grandfather's cufflink. I did what I had to do for my future. You always said law was about the long game, Dad. Leland and the board, they had a situation. A budget discrepancy at the hospital, the one I know you've been looking into. The cold lead in my stomach hardened into a diamond-sharp clarity. To secure his position at Breyer's firm, Milo had signed a non-disclosure agreement. He had agreed to silence the very investigation I was conducting, the one that proved the Sterlings were siphoning hospital funds to cover their private debts. He hadn't just moved tables, he had moved sides. He didn't just sign a contract, he signed a confession. He had traded my life's work and my integrity for a partnership track in a firm built on fraud. The long game doesn't work if you sell the board before the first move, Milo. You didn't just betray me. You betrayed every patient Helena ever cared for. Milo straightened his back, his jaw tightening with a defiant, ugly pride. It's too late for the moral high ground, Dad. The deal is done. The wedding ceremony already happened privately in the judge's chambers this morning. This whole thing tonight, the flowers, the music, the guests, it's just a performance for the Sterling's clients. We're already legal. The shock of it hit me like a physical blow. The betrayal was complete. He had excluded me from the only part of the day that truly mattered, leaving me to play a supporting role in a play I hadn't been allowed to read. As the music swelled for the grand entrance, a triumphant orchestral burst that seemed to mock my silence, Milo checked his watch. Time to go, he said, his voice flat and professional. Try to look happy. It's a celebration. He walked away from me toward the woman who wore my wife's stolen memories around her neck, leaving me alone in the shadows. He thought he had ended the game. He thought he had secured his future by burying my past. But as I watched him step out into the light, I realized that I was no longer the victim of his play. I was the only person in the room who knew how the final act was supposed to end, and I was going to make sure the director's cut was a tragedy for everyone involved. I smoothed my $48 Kohl's jacket and took my seat behind the marble pillar. Watching the elite of Palm Beach toast to a future built on the very legal foundations I had spent 30 years drafting in secret, the grand ballroom of the Breakers hummed with the sound of thousands of dollars in shared laughter, a symphony of arrogance that I was meant to observe from the shadows. As the music swelled for the grand entrance, Milo had walked away from me, toward the woman who wore my wife's stolen memories around her neck, leaving me with one final choice: to be the victim of his play or the director of his downfall. I reached for a dinner roll, breaking the dry, flavorless bread with a precision that comes from a lifetime of auditing life and death contracts. The scent of expensive sea bass was already beginning to fill the room, clashing unpleasantly with the cold, damp smell of the marble at my back. I sat alone at table 12, a ghost at my own son's feast, watching the distant figure of Leland Norcross. The board member kept glancing my way, his face pale, his conscience clearly rattling like a loose shutter in a hurricane. I didn't acknowledge him. I simply waited. I knew the rhythm of power far better than the people currently flaunting it. Thane Garrison. I thought I recognized that stubborn posture from across the room. The voice was loud, warm, and utterly indifferent to the hushed, curated tone of the ballroom. I looked up to see Janet Miller, the chief nursing administrator, and a woman who had seen more trauma and triumph in a single ER shift than the Sterlings had in their entire curated lives. Sweeping toward our table with the authority of a hurricane. Janet. "You're making a scene," I said. A genuine smile finally touching my face as I felt the warmth of her hand on my shoulder. "People will think I'm important." "You are important, you old fox," she laughed, pulling out the empty chair next to me. The sharp metallic clink of Briar's fork hitting her plate at the neighboring table signaled that the royalty had noticed our corner. Briar and Clementine were staring, their expressions a mix of confusion and mounting irritation. They had spent the evening treating me like a janitor who had wandered into the wrong room, yet here was the hospital's highest-ranking administrator greeting me like a long-lost brother. Janet Miller didn't care about their visual standards. She began praising my retirement, her voice carrying easily through the air. The board hasn't been the same since you left Thane. Nobody knows how to navigate those $15 million contract disputes like you did. I watched Briar's wineglass pause mid-air, her eyes widening as the reality of my institutional support role began to reframe itself into high-level legal authority. The Sterlings weren't just eating dinner, they were swallowing the first bitter pills of a reality check they weren't prepared to digest. It was just paperwork, Janet, I said softly. Right, Briar. Janet snorted, ignoring my attempt at deflection. Paperwork. You managed a $2.9 million budget and a 42-person legal department for 15 years. And don't get me started on the firm contracts. She turned her head toward Briar, her eyes narrowing with a sudden realization. Wait, Briar Sterling. You're with Sterling and Associates, aren't you? Briar nodded slowly, her socialite mask beginning to crack at the edges. Well then, you should be thanking this man, Janet said with a sharp grin. Thane was the one who personally drafted the master employment contract your firm uses. The hospital system is your largest client because he made sure the legal language was airtight. The silence that followed was thick and heavy, a physical weight that seemed to press the oxygen out of the alcove. Why is it that the people who scream the loudest about their class are always the ones most terrified of someone who actually built the stage they're standing on? Clementine Sterling was the first to recover her voice tight and high-pitched. Administering a budget is very respectable, I'm sure she said, reaching for her champagne with a trembling hand. But Briar deals with actual litigation. The stakes are just different in the courtroom than they are in an office. I looked at Clementine, then at Briar. You're right, Clementine, I said, my voice as calm as a frozen lake. In my world, when we lose a contract or a negligence suit, people lose their jobs and their homes. Entire departments vanish. In Briar's world, they just lose a billable hour. Briar's Harvard law degree was a shield she kept thrusting forward, unaware that I was the one who had sharpened the blade she was so proud of wielding. She tried to double down her chin, lifting in a defiant gesture. Institutional work is essentially middle management, Everett Vance always says. It's bureaucracy, not legal artistry. Janet looked at Briar with a growing sense of horror, the kind a doctor feels when they realize a patient is beyond saving. Middle management, she whispered. Thane Garrison was the general counsel. He sat on the executive board for 2 decades. Briar, he signed your partnership track recommendation before he walked out the door. The Sterlings fell silent again, the irony of their condescension finally settling into their bones like a deep chill. Clementine accidentally let a small gasp slip her eyes, darting toward the head table. I thought I recognized the name Garrison from a legal warning we received years ago. She stammered, her face draining of color. I assumed it was just a low-level clerk who had made a mistake on the filing. A low-level clerk, I repeated, enjoying the taste of the words. I remember that warning, Clementine. It was about the practice audit. Janet Miller stood up, then squeezing my shoulder one last time. She didn't stay for the C-base. She had seen enough. As Janet walked away, she squeezed my shoulder and whispered a question that made Briar's face go from pale to ashen. Did you tell them about the audit, Thane? The word audit hung over the table like a guillotine blade, and as I watched Briar's hand tremble while reaching for her water, I realized that the fear in her eyes wasn't for her family's reputation. It was for the secret she thought she'd buried. She believed that by marrying my son and silencing the man she viewed as a mere bureaucrat, she had closed the book on her firm's indiscretions. What she didn't know was that the audit Janet Miller alluded to wasn't a standard hospital financial review. It was a secret integrity audit I had personally initiated on Sterling and Associates 3 months before my retirement. I had been the one to sign the authorization, moving the pieces across the board in silence, waiting for the moment the Sterlings would realize their largest client was also their most diligent investigator. I sat perfectly still, my expression a mask of clinical detachment, watching the realization dawn on her that I was more than just a ghost in a Kohl's suit. Avery, the wedding coordinator, whose headset was skewed and whose eyes were wide with the panic of someone caught between two warring families, approached me with an iPad clutched like a shield. The smell of her nervous sweat reached me before she did, cutting through the expensive floral perfume that saturated the air. "Mr. Garrison, I've been looking at the final logs." She stammered, her voice barely a whisper against the rhythmic mocking thump of the dance floor music in the distance. "I just wanted to personally apologize for the seating logistics. This wasn't the original plan." I looked at the young woman, noting the way she avoided the gaze of the Sterlings. "Plans change, Avery," I said, my voice steady. "I'm a lawyer. I'm more interested in the why than the what. Show me the digital paper trail." She hesitated, her fingers twitching near the iPad's home button, but my calm authority seemed to override her fear of the bride. She turned the screen toward me, the blue-white glare of the seating chart illuminating the dim corner behind our pillar. A digital record doesn't have feelings, but it can certainly break a heart in high definition. Avery scrolled through the back-end logs of the wedding software, showing me the chronological history of Table 12. I watched the pixels shift as my name was dragged from the head table to this exile corner. The change had been made at 11:42 p.m. on Tuesday, exactly 72 hours before the ceremony. My heart hardened into a cold, dense mass as I saw the user ID attached to the final edit. It was a login I recognized instantly. M.Garrison_legal, my son. He didn't just approve it, he executed it. I stared at the glass screen, the cool, smooth surface under my thumb, feeling like the edge of a blade. Have you ever seen the exact moment a son decides his father is an embarrassment worth hiding for a partnership track? It's not a loud sound, just the soft tapping of a stylus erasing a lifetime of fatherhood. I felt the heat of the ballroom pressing in on me, but my blood felt like ice. I scrolled further down the list of edits, finding the special instructions field. There, in the same cold font, were the notes that Milo had left for the staff. The instructions described me as a potential liability for the Sterling family's image and specifically ordered the coordinator to minimize my visibility during the live stream. Milo had requested that the cameras avoid my table entirely, framing the event as if the Garrison side of the family didn't exist at all. Avery's tinny, frantic headset chatter hummed in the background as she looked at me with profound pity. "He said you'd be more comfortable in a less formal section, sir," she whispered. "He was very insistent that you wouldn't want the spotlight." I let out a slow, controlled breath, the metallic scent of the hotel's floor wax filling my lungs. "He wasn't protecting my comfort, Avery. He was protecting his commission." Milo was trying to bury me in the shadows of Table 12, unaware that I am an expert at navigating the dark. I had spent my career in the windowless offices of the General Counsel's suite, finding the things people thought they had hidden in the margins. He had learned the mechanics of the law from me, but he had never learned the weight of it. As I handed the iPad back to Avery, my fingers were steady despite the fire burning in my chest. I had seen enough of the digital trail to know that the betrayal wasn't a mistake or a Sterling whim. It was a calculated sacrifice by the person I had sacrificed everything to protect. But there was one more thing Avery had accidentally revealed as she flipped through the screens. She had opened the bar's service log for our table. While the rest of the ballroom was being served Krug champagne and top-shelf bourbon, Milo had specifically instructed the bar to limit my table's options to the house budget menu. He had downgraded his own father to the cheapest swill in the building, while he toasted his new life with vintage gold. The pettiness of it was almost more insulting than the seating. It showed a level of premeditated disrespect that reached into every corner of the evening. I realized then that the seating chart wasn't the only thing Milo had tampered with. He was the one who had handled the final delivery of the wedding license to the judge's chambers earlier that morning. I thought about the document currently resting in his tuxedo pocket, waiting for the formal filing after the reception. I handed the iPad back to Avery, my fingers steady despite the fire in my chest. And I realized that the seating chart wasn't the only thing Milo had tampered with. The wedding license in his pocket was still missing my signature. He had been so focused on hiding me that he had forgotten the one legal requirement that still gave me power over his future. I stood up, adjusting the sleeves of my Kohl's jacket, the fabric feeling like armor. I wasn't just a guest anymore. I was the auditor, and the Sterlings were about to find out that my signature was the most expensive thing in the room. I watched the flash of the photographer's strobe, light from the shadows, every burst of white light, a reminder of the family history they were systematically rewriting without me. I stood up from Table 12, my movements precise and unhurried. The The blue-white glare of the seating chart was still burned into my retinas, a digital map of my son's betrayal, but I didn't head for the exit. I adjusted my Kohl's jacket and moved toward the grand staircase where the formal portraits were being finalized. The photographer, a man with $1,000 lens and a 10-cent sense of empathy, looked at me as if I were a blemish on his carefully curated composition. He was busy directing a group of junior associates from Breyer's firm, barking orders about chin angles and lighting ratios. I stepped into his peripheral vision and waited for the inevitable click of the shutter to fade. "Excuse me," I said, my voice carrying that low administrative authority that used to quiet entire hospital boardrooms. "I noticed my name hasn't been called for the family grouping. Is there a timing issue?" The photographer lowered his camera, his sigh audible over the muffled quartet. He picked up a clipboard and ran a manicured finger down a list. I watched as his eyes found my name. It had been struck through with a heavy, aggressive line of red ink that seemed to bleed into the white paper. "I'm sorry, sir, but your name is on the do not shoot list," he said, not looking me in the eye. "We have to maintain the visual flow for the primary stakeholders." The groom's representative was very specific about skipping the secondary family to keep the aesthetic of the Sterling legacy consistent. Visual flow. I asked, my tone as dry as a desert bone. Or is it just a lack of proper lighting for a $50 suit? He didn't answer, already turning back to his tripod. "Have you ever been deleted from your own son's history? It's not a violent act. It's just the quiet stroke of a pen on a clipboard, turning a father into a ghost." I stood there for a moment, the sharp pop of the strobe light blinding me again. Just as I was about to turn away, Breyer Sterling glided past her silk veil, trailing behind her, like a plume of white smoke. She paused, adjusting the fall of her lace sleeve, and caught the end of my exchange. She didn't look like a bride in that moment. She looked like a CEO managing a minor inventory discrepancy. "Don't take it personally, Thane," she said, her voice a cool breeze that held no warmth. "This isn't just a wedding. It's a branding exercise for Milo's new firm. We've secured a high-gloss feature in Prestige Legal, and frankly, a Kohl's suit would ruin the lighting for the spread. We need to project a certain level of institutional wealth." I looked at her, my eyes tracing the silver glint of the locket around her neck, the one she had stolen from Helena. "Be careful, Breyer," I replied, my voice surgically calm. "Brands built on paper-thin foundations tend to burn the brightest when they catch fire." She offered a tight, artificial smile. "My foundations are Yale-certified Thane. Stay in the shadows for the rest of the night. You're less of a distraction to the Sterling brand back there." She moved on, the rhythmic mocking click of her heels echoing on the marble. As I watched her go, knowing a secret she didn't. The magazine she was so desperate to impress, Prestige Legal, was owned by a parent company that had been using me as their lead consultant on ethical business practices for 7 years. I could kill her branding exercise with a single phone call, but I wanted something more permanent than a retracted article. Lighting can hide a cheap suit, but it can't hide a bankrupt soul. I moved away from the staircase, heading toward the bar area, where the scent of ozone from the flashes clashing with expensive gin. Before I reveal the truth behind the foreclosure line on the Sterling estate, I have to ask, are you still with me? Comment A if you think I should expose them now, or B if I should wait for the toasts and tell me why. Please note, what follows contains recreated details for narrative purposes to illustrate the core message. If you prefer strictly factual retellings, you are free to stop here. I reached the edge of the darkened lounge and saw them. Clementine Sterling was speaking frantically to Leland Norcross in a corner, partially obscured by a large fern. Her socialite mask was slipping, revealing the raw, sweating panic of a woman whose fraudulent world was about to collide with reality. I clutched a cold, wet cocktail napkin in my hand, my thumb tracing the grain of the paper. "Leland, you have to talk to the board." Clementine hissed, her voice a frantic whisper that cut through the low hum of the Vivaldi playing in the background. Her eyes darted to her phone screen every few seconds. "If the short-term loan doesn't clear by midnight, the foreclosure lien becomes public. We lose the house, the practice, everything." "I can't help you," Clementine Norcross replied, his voice heavy with a weary kind of disgust. He looked like a man who had finally realized he was tied to a sinking anchor. "Thane Garrison is the one who holds the integrity audit logs, not me. If he presents that data to the board, no loan in the world will save you." Clementine's face drained of color, turning a sickly shade of gray that the ballroom's amber lighting couldn't mask. She looked around the room, her gaze frantic until it landed on me. Clementine was a drowning woman clutching at a lead anchor of pride, convinced it was a life preserver. I didn't look away. I stood there in my cheap suit, my eyes fixed on her neck. I noticed she was wearing a diamond necklace, the stones catching the light, with a brilliant blue-white fire. It was a distinctive piece, 3 pair-cut diamonds suspended from a delicate platinum chain. It matched the exact description of a lost hospital endowment piece I had spent 2 years investigating before my retirement. It was worth more than the entire wedding. Clementine caught my eye through the crowd, and for the first time tonight, the arrogance in her expression was replaced by the cold, paralyzing realization that I wasn't just a guest, I was her executioner. I raised my ginger ale in a silent, lethal toast. I tapped the edge of my crystal glass with a dessert spoon, the sound sharp enough to cut through the hum of Palm Beach socialites like a warning bell on a sinking ship. The high-pitched crystalline ring vibrated through the ballroom, silencing the chatter of 180 guests. For a moment, the only sound was the muffled thump of the surf against the hotel's stone seawall. I stood up at table 12, my movements slow and deliberate. Clementine Sterling caught my eye through the crowd, and for the first time tonight, the arrogance in her expression was replaced by the cold, paralyzing realization that I wasn't just a guest, I was her executioner. I didn't wait for the master of ceremonies to introduce me. I had spent my life waiting in the margins, and tonight I was taking the center of the room. We have heard a great deal this evening about legacy and the foundations of the Sterling family. I began my voice carrying that calm, mathematical precision that used to quiet the most chaotic hospital boardrooms. I noticed the irony of being seated behind this magnificent marble pillar, while the bedrock of this marriage was being praised. But if we are to toast to the foundations of this family, perhaps we should look at the actual ledgers upon which it was built. Thanes, sit down, Clementine hissed from the head table, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the silk tablecloth. You've had too much of that cheap beer you prefer. You're making a fool of yourself. A lie is just an asset with a high interest rate. Tonight the bill is due. I didn't sit. Instead, I pulled out my phone and tapped a sequence I had memorized weeks ago. I wasn't just a retired lawyer. I was the one who personally oversaw the hospital's legal department that flagged Clementine's practice for the very audit that led to her exposure. I had been the one who signed the internal memos. I had been the silent architect of this moment. Suddenly, the large screens flanking the ballroom, the ones intended for a montage of Briar and Milo's childhood photos, flickered to life. Instead of baby pictures, they displayed a sterile blue-tinted public record from the Florida Department of Health. It was a malpractice settlement from March 2022. Dr. Clementine Sterling. I read aloud, my voice echoing in the absolute silence of the room, settled a $3.5 million claim after a surgical error left the Patterson family in ruins. A $2.2 million award went to the family Clementine, but the records show you didn't pay it. You filed for a discreet bankruptcy through a Delaware shell corporation to hide your assets while you continued to lease an estate you no longer owned. You have no right to show that. Clementine screamed, her socialite mask finally shattering. That is private information. It was public, I replied, my eyes fixed on her. You just paid a lot of money to make sure nobody looked at the back pages of the legal journals. How many designer suits can you buy with the money meant for a paralyzed patient settlement? Clementine? I looked around the room, watching the horrified faces of the Palm Beach elite as they processed the fact that they were dining with a fraud. The smell of the expensive lilies in the centerpieces seemed to turn sour in the heat of the tension. I turned my attention to Briar and Milo. I systematically deconstruct the lifestyle we see tonight. The Sterling's oceanfront estate has a 96% mortgage. Those matching European SUVs in the driveway, a $2,400 monthly lease. And let's not forget the $180,000 in secret credit card debt used to fund this very reception. I contrast this with my own life. I live in a paid-off home. I have $960,000 in debt-free savings. I am the man you seated at the budget table, yet I am the only one in this family who actually owns the shoes on my feet. I looked directly at Milo, my son whose face was a mask of pure, unadulterated shame. "Tell me, Milo," I asked, my voice dropping to a low, lethal tone. "Did they tell you that your partnership at the firm was contingent on the hospital system not looking too closely at their practice's sale? Did you know you were being traded as collateral for a family that is essentially a financial ghost?" "Dad, stop this," Milo whispered, his voice cracking. "Please just stop." But I wasn't finished. The Sterlings weren't a dynasty. They were a stage play with a maxed-out credit card and a cast that forgot the play has an ending. And then I delivered the final blow. I looked at the shimmering glasses of Krug champagne being held by the guests, the $300 vintage I had been denied at my own table. "I want everyone to enjoy the champagne," I said, a cold smile touching my lips. Because according to the hospital's internal procurement logs, this vintage was actually billed to the Helena Garrison Memorial Fund. "Breyer, you signed the legal expense voucher yourself, didn't you? You stole from a fund for dying patients to pay for your wedding toast." The silence that followed was heavy, a suffocating pressure that made the air in the ballroom feel thin. Every guest looked down at their glass as if it contained poison. Breyer's eyes swept the 180 horrified faces in the room, her gaze landing wildly on the 5-tier wedding cake, as if seeking some weapon of control, and for the first time. I saw the attorney's logic vanish, replaced by a raw, entitled violence. She looked at me, her face contorted, and I knew the performance was over. The stage was collapsing, and she was the only one left who didn't know how to take a bow. Breyer didn't scream. She didn't even argue. Instead, she moved with a predatory grace toward the $8,500 centerpiece of her curated life, her fingers clawing into the tiers of white fondant as if they were the flesh of an enemy. I watched from my seat at table 12, perfectly positioned near the most prominent hospital board member's table. I had chosen this spot with mathematical precision, knowing that if Breyer snapped, I wanted the most powerful witnesses in the room to have a front row seat to the performance. The grand ballroom fell into a suffocating silence, the only sound the frantic rustle of Breyer's designer silk as she reached for the gold leaf top tier of the cake. Faced with the public exposure of her mother's bankruptcy and the theft of the memorial fund, Breyer attempted one final desperate toast to regain control. She stood tall, her chin trembling, but her eyes burning with a manic fire. "My family built this legacy with blood, sweat, and billable hours," she declared, her voice cracking as it echoed across the crystalline orchids. "How dare you suggest we are anything less than self-made? We are the Sterlings. We do not fail." I looked at her, my expression as flat as a deposition transcript. "Pride is a poor substitute for a balance sheet," Breyer, I said softly, yet my voice carried through the void. I had already positioned my thumb over the digital bank records on my phone, ready to dismantle the Yale Law grit story she was weaving, but she didn't give me the chance to speak again. Have you ever seen the exact moment a human being discards $40,000 worth of education for 30 seconds of petty vengeance? The logic of the Yale-educated attorney finally snapped. Under the weight of my silent judgment, she lunged. Milo shouted for her to stop his voice, a ragged plea that went ignored. Breyer was beyond reason. Her designer gown, a masterpiece of lace and ego, caught on the edge of the silver cake table as she hefted the heavy top tier like a blunt instrument. Orchids tumbled to the marble floor, crushed under her frantic movement. "You want to talk about belonging, Thane?" She hissed, her face contorted into something unrecognizable. "You want to know your place?" She marched across the floor, the rhythmic click of her heels, replaced by a heavy, purposeful stomp. Breyer didn't just toss the cake. She smashed the tier directly into my face with the full weight of her entitled rage. The impact was heavy, a wet thwack that felt like a physical assault. Cold buttercream and tart raspberry filling exploded across my skin, stinging my eyes and soaking into the collar of my Kohl's suit. I sat perfectly still. I didn't flinch, and I didn't wipe the mess away. I let the gold leaf flake off my cheek and the jam pool on my $48 jacket. I wanted every guest and the high-definition cameras Milo had hired to document their perfection, to capture the raw, unedited cruelty of the Sterling bride. The gold leaf didn't shine on her. It stuck to me like tears. "Know your place!" Breyer screamed, her chest heaving as she stood over me, her hands dripping with white frosting. "You don't belong with real people. You never did. You are just the help we let into the room." I remained silent, a clinical observer of my own humiliation. In my mind, I thanked her. By refusing to show pain or anger, I had transformed her victory into a battery. She had just signed her own professional death warrant in front of every senior partner she ever hoped to impress. The absolute suffocating silence of the 180 guests was broken only by the sound of the raspberry preserves dripping from my chin onto the white linen. Have you ever seen the exact moment a son decides his father is an embarrassment worth hiding, only to realize the embarrassment is the woman he just married? As the cake continued to slide down my skin, something silver caught the light, emerging from the red smear of the filling that had hit my chest. It was a small, heavy object that Briar must have hidden in the cake for luck, or perhaps as a sick tribute to her own cleverness. It was Helena's locket. The silver was tarnished by the jam, but the shape was unmistakable. Briar hadn't just stolen it. She had desecrated it, turning my wife's most precious memory into a party favor for a fraud. The buttercream was a mask she had tried to force on me, but all she did was reveal the ugliness of the face she kept hidden behind her Yale degree. I looked up at her, the raspberry jam blurring my vision, but I could see her smile begin to falter. She saw the locket. She saw the room looking at the locket. And then she saw Milo. The shame in my son's eyes was being replaced by a terrifying, icy clarity. He wasn't looking at me with pity anymore. He was looking at his wife, as if he were seeing a stranger for the first time. The air in the ballroom felt heavy, cloying with the smell of overly sweet vanilla and the sharp metallic scent of the sterling legacy finally rotting in public. I didn't need to say a word. The math was done. The variables had all collapsed into a single undeniable truth. As the raspberry jam pooled on my jacket, I saw Milo finally stand up. The scrape of his chair against the marble floor was a sound like a gavel hitting a desk, signaling that the trial of the Garrison family was over, and the sentencing was about to begin. The scrape of Milo's chair against the marble was the only sound in a room of 180 people who had just watched my son's wife treat me like a trash bin for an $8,000 cake. As the raspberry jam pooled on my $48 jacket, I saw Milo finally stand up, the shame in his eyes replaced by a terrifying icy clarity that made Briar's victorious smile falter. I sat perfectly still, letting the gold leaf flake off my cheek and the buttercream slide down my collar, a stoic witness to the end of an era. Milo began to walk the length of the ballroom, a path that took him past the tables of the elite who had spent the evening looking through me. The silence was absolute, a heavy, suffocant pressure that seemed to drain the oxygen from the room. His eyes were fixed not on his bride, but on the raspberry preserves dripping from my chin. Every step he took felt like a measurement of the distance between the man he had become and the boy I had raised. The tables of Palm Beach royalty pulled back as he passed, as if the shame radiating from him were a contagious disease. I remained motionless, a clinical observer in a ruined suit, watching my son finally see the monster he had invited into our family. How many years of fatherhood do you have to trade for a single night of pretending you're a sterling Briar? Stood over me, her chest heaving with exertion. Her silk gloves stained a violent pink with the filling. She didn't look like a lawyer or a bride. She looked like a spoiled child who had finally broken her favorite toy. She expected Milo to defend her, to validate her righteous anger at the exposure of her family's bankruptcy. Instead of an apology, she turned her head toward the head table and snapped her fingers. "Milo, tell them to get a towel," she barked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Your father's little stunt almost ruined my gown. The waitstaff needs to clean this up before the dancing starts." I watched Milo stop 3 feet from her. His grandfather's tuxedo was stained with a stray smear of cake, but he had never looked more like a Garrison. "Your gown, Milo?" asked his voice, a low, dangerous rumble that I hadn't heard in years. "Briar, you just assaulted my father in front of everyone we know. You stole from my mother's memorial fund to pay for that wine." The gold band hit the floor. It didn't ring. It thudded like a lead weight. Briar's face contorted, her unrepentant arrogance clashing with the sudden shift in the room's gravity. It was just a reaction. Milo, he was trying to destroy us. We were supposed to be a team. "A team doesn't build its foundation on theft and silence," Briar Milo replied. He reached into the pocket of his tuxedo and pulled out the small silver object he had just retrieved from the cake mess on the floor. It was Helena's locket. He stared at her face inside the silver frame, his thumb tracing the metal as if seeking guidance. I sat there, the cold, damp feeling of the raspberry filling against my skin, a reminder of the price of truth. Milo looked at Briar with a gaze that was finally mercifully free of the marrying up delusion. He realized then what I had known for months: he hadn't hidden the marriage license in the Honda Civic for safety. He had hidden it because he had been having second thoughts for weeks, keeping a back door open in case the sterling facade finally cracked. He had been waiting for a reason to run, and Briar had just given him 180 of them. Milo twisted the gold band off his finger, holding it up so the light of the chandeliers caught the polished surface. "This marriage didn't die because of my father's bank records, Briar. It died the second you decided that money gave you the right to be cruel." He let the ring drop. The tiny crystalline ping of the gold hitting the marble was louder than any shout. "You're choosing him?" Briar screamed, her voice reaching a frantic, jagged pitch. Over us! Over our future, you'll be nothing without the Sterling name. Milo didn't even look back at her. He looked at me, and for the first time in 6 years, the wall between us was gone. The M. Garrison legal user ID that had moved me to table 12 and limited my drinks wasn't my son's doing. I saw the realization in his eyes. Briar had stolen his login and password months ago, manipulating the entire event to erase his father while making it look like his own choice. She had been gaslighting both of us from the start. Milo was finally stepping out of the shadow of her ambition and into the harsh, clean light of the truth. He was a man who had finally found his spine, and it was made of the same iron as his mother's. As the ring settled into the raspberry-stained carpet, Milo didn't look back at his bride. He knelt in the mess at my feet. The sight of my son in a designer tuxedo, kneeling in cake on a marble floor in front of the Palm Beach elite, was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. He leaned in, his forehead almost touching mine, and whispered the words I'd been waiting 6 years to hear. Forgive me, Dad. I forgot who we were. I reached out a cake-stained hand and placed it on his shoulder, the weight of the moment anchoring us both. I didn't care about the suit or the Sterlings or the bank records anymore. I had my son back. But the evening wasn't over. The legal community was still watching, and I still had the bank records on my phone. Briar was staring at the empty space on her finger, her knees beginning to buckle as the gravity of her professional and personal collapse finally hit her. As the ring settled into the raspberry-stained carpet, Milo didn't look back at his bride. He knelt in the mess at my feet and whispered the words I'd been waiting 6 years to hear. The smell of raspberry filling was sickeningly sweet as my son's knees hit the marble, the sound of his pride breaking far louder than the gasps of the 180 witnesses surrounding us. Milo didn't care about the stains on his tuxedo or the judgmental stares of the Sterling's elite guests. He took my hand, his fingers trembling, and for the first time in 6 years, I saw my son looking at me without the fog of ambition in his eyes. I am so sorry, Dad, he whispered, his voice thick with a regret that had been years in the making. I thought I was building a future, but I was just helping them dig your grave. I let Briar convince me that you were the one holding us back, that your principles were just old-fashioned bureaucracy. I looked down at him, my heart aching with a quiet sorrow. I didn't feel the anger he expected. Instead, I felt the relief of a father watching his son finally wake up in a burning house. I forgive you, Milo, I said, my voice steady despite the sticky, heavy weight of the jam on my face. But a house built on a grave never stands for long. Forgiveness is a quiet thing. Justice, on the other hand, is deafening. I could see the Sterlings scrambling to regain control of the narrative, their eyes darting like trapped animals. Briar lunged forward, her silk gown rustling aggressively as she tried to pull Milo to his feet. Get up, Milo! You're making a scene, she hissed, her face a mask of frantic arrogance. We can fix this. I'll have my mother call the board. We'll have his retirement benefits frozen for harassment. He's just a bitter old man in a cheap suit. She turned to the room, trying to force a laugh. I'm so sorry, everyone. My father-in-law has always struggled with cognitive stability. He's clearly had an episode. Milo stood up slowly, wiping a smear of buttercream from his grandfather's tuxedo sleeve. He didn't look at her with anger, but with a clinical kind of pity that was far more devastating. You can't fix this, Briar, and you can't divorce me either. You can't even sue me for a breach of contract, because legally there is no contract. Briar's eyes widened, her chest heaving. We were at the courthouse this morning. Everyone saw us walk into the judge's chambers. Milo reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, the edges crisp and white. They saw us walk in, Briar. They didn't see me sign. The wedding license is blank. I hid it in the glove box of my dad's Honda Civic while you were busy checking the lighting for the photographer. This entire evening was nothing more than an expensive dress rehearsal. How many thousands of dollars did she spend on a wedding that technically never happened? The silence that followed was absolute. A void so profound it felt like the ballroom had been vacuumed of air. Briar's knees buckled, her hand reaching out for the table, but finding only the ruined ruins of the cake. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She was currently standing in the wreckage of a non-marriage wearing a stolen locket, in front of the very people she had spent her life trying to impress. The Sterlings were trying to hold on to a ghost, their fingers grasping at the air where a medical dynasty used to be. I stood up tall, cake-covered, but more powerful than any person in the room. I felt the weight of the bank records in my pocket, the final piece of the audit that was about to go public. Briar, Did you really think I wouldn't check the credentials of the official you handpicked for this morning? I asked. She looked at me, her face pale and smeared with red filling. The judge you thought you were dealing with was actually my former law partner. He was in on the plan to delay the signing the moment I saw you wearing Helena's locket in that hospice room years ago. We were just waiting for you to show your true face to the world. Clementine Sterling tried to intervene, her voice a shrill, desperate shriek. This is a nightmare, Milo. Sign the papers now, and we can forget this happened. We can issue a press release. The Sterling brand depends on this. Milo turned to her, his posture rigid. The only thing I'm forgetting, Clementine, is that I ever thought you were worth my father's respect. He turned back to me, and for the first time he offered me his arm. Let's go, Dad. I've seen enough. But I wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. I had one more transaction to complete. I looked at Briar, who was now shivering despite the Florida heat. You made a comment earlier about marrying up Briar. You thought you were the one providing the foundation. But you forgot that every legal degree has a paper trail, and every scholarship has a character clause. Milo moved me to table 12, not to hide me, but to ensure I was near the emergency exit so we could leave quickly after the performance ended. He was protecting me from you, even when he didn't know how to say it. Briar's knees finally gave out, and she collapsed into the buttercream ruins of her own ambition. She stared at the empty space on her finger, where a legacy should have been her breathing, coming in sharp, panicked gasps. The 180 witnesses were no longer her audience. They were her jury. As I reached for my phone, I leaned down and whispered the one truth that would ensure she never wore a ring in this town again. The scholarship that paid for your Yale degree. It wasn't a gift from the university. It was a private grant from the Helena Garrison Memorial Fund, and I'm the one who just signed the termination papers for cause. Briar's face went from pale to ashen as the legal trap I had laid 6 years ago snapped shut. The bill was finally due, and she was bankrupt in more ways than one. I unlocked my phone, the screen's light cutting through the dim, tension-thick air of the ballroom, and scrolled to the transaction history that would turn Briar's Yale law degree into a debt she could never repay. I stood tall, clearing my throat with a deliberate sound that acted as a gavel for the absolute silence of the 180 guests. The bill for years of arrogance was finally coming due, and I was the only one who could process the transaction. I turned my phone toward the nearest guests and then leaned toward the wedding videographer, ensuring the high-definition lens captured the banking app for the Helena Garrison Memorial Fund. Look closely, I said, my voice echoing in the hollow space left by the Sterling's shattered dignity. This is the account you claimed was institutional charity. The current balance is $119,800. But look at the outflows from 2017 to 2020. I pointed to the glowing numbers, a total of $440,000. You bragged about your sterling grit and your mother's sacrifices. Briar, you looked down at me from your Yale pedestal, as if you had built it with your own hands. But the Sterling family account never touched a single Yale tuition bill. My wife's life insurance did. Briar stared at the blue light reflecting in her shocked eyes, her chest heaving as if the air had become solid. That's impossible, she whispered, her voice a thin, ragged thing. My mother said, she said it was a private endowment. She said the university had recognized my brilliance. Status is a loan. Character is the only thing you actually own. I scrolled to the transaction notes semester by semester. Each payment was meticulously labeled with scholarship ID B-STER-77. I watched as the guests leaned in, their eyes darting between the digital evidence and the bride who was currently losing the only thing she valued, her status. Helena insisted on a policy of anonymous giving. I continued my thumb warming against the glass of the phone. She wanted the recipients to feel worthy of their own success. She wanted to believe that a young woman with ambition could change the world if she just had the chance. You weren't an elite Briar. You were a project. You were the girl in room 314 that my wife thought had a soul. Briar's Yale class ring seemed to grow heavy on her trembling finger, a piece of gold that was now a shackle. You paid for everything she asked, her voice cracking. The books, the housing. Every cent, I replied. The man you seated at table 12, the man you erased from the photos, the man you just assaulted with a gold-leafed cake, he is the one who bought your seat at the bar. How does it feel to realize your entire identity was purchased by the man you tried to erase? I watched her socialite facade crumble, the Yale pedigree vanishing as the truth settled into her bones like a deep chill. She looked around the room, but no one met her eyes. The junior partners from her firm were already looking at their phones, likely drafting emails to their ethics committee. I reached into my soul and pulled out the final, most devastating truth. Breyer, you remember room 314, not just because you were a volunteer. You remember it because that's where you practiced your socialite charm on a dying woman you considered a nobody. You thought she was just a lonely patient who liked your stories. But she was listening. She was judging. She wrote a handwritten note specifically mentioning your potential for compassion. It was that note, that single page of misplaced faith, that authorized the payout of $440,000. She died believing you were the person she hoped our son would marry. She died giving you a future you just threw away for a gold-leafed cake. Breyer made a wounded sound, a low, guttural moan of moral defeat. The patient in 314. That was your wife, she asked, her eyes wild. She looked at the dying lilies in the ballroom, their scent now cloying and rotten in the heat of the scene. I watched her hand fly to the silver locket around her neck, the one she had looted from that very bedside. I didn't need to say a word about the theft. The room could see it. They could see the stolen memories glinting against her skin. Breyer was a castle built on air, and I had just turned off the wind. She looked at her mother, but Clementine Sterling was staring at the floor, her own debts finally catching up to her. The Sterling brand was a charred ruin, and Milo was already moving away his back to the woman who had tried to buy him with my wife's money. Milo looked at the screen, then at me, and I saw the absolute horror of a man who realized he had almost married the person who had looted his mother's final moments. Breyer whispered the name of the fund, the H.G. Memorial Fund, realizing that the prestigious merit award she had listed on her resume as a sign of her brilliance was actually just a gift from the woman she had robbed. As Breyer's knees hit the marble floor, she whispered the words that would trigger the legal trap Helena and I had laid 6 years ago, a trap she had just walked into with both feet. I didn't know, she sobbed. But in the world of the law, ignorance of the person you are robbing is never a defense. I stood over her, the raspberry jam still staining my jacket, the silent observer who had finally become the judge. I cleared my throat, the sound sharp and terminal. The performance was over. Now it was time for the audit. I didn't reach for a weapon. I reached for a fountain pen and a 3-page legal document. The ink already dry on a trap that had been waiting for Breyer Sterling to prove she was exactly who she showed us tonight. I cleared my throat, a sound that cut through the gasps and the frantic hushed whispers like a gavel striking a marble bench. Breyer remained on her knees, her designer gown a tragedy of lace and raspberry, preserves her face a pale mask of shock. I produced the physical scholarship charter from my inside jacket pocket. The paper was heavy cream-colored and felt substantial in my hands. The crisp, dry sound of the charter unfolding was the only thing heard as I stood over her. Many people in this room think of philanthropy as a one-way street. I said, my voice mathematically precise and devoid of the anger she probably expected. But Helena viewed it as a partnership based on trust. This document wasn't just funded by life insurance. It was bolstered by a specific restorative justice rider that Helena insisted on adding after she caught a young volunteer stealing a silver locket from her bedside years ago. She wanted to believe people could change, but she also knew that real change requires accountability. Breyer's eyes widened her smeared makeup, making her look like a ghost haunted by the very woman she had robbed. I began to read Clause 7, 3 of the Helena Garrison Memorial Fund Charter, aloud to the silent ballroom. The text was clear. The grant was strictly contingent upon the recipient maintaining ongoing moral integrity and respect toward all human beings regardless of social or professional status. Law isn't about who is right. It's about who has the better signature on the better paper. I looked down at the mess Breyer had made of my suit and her own reputation. Your physical assault on the fund's administrator, me, constitutes an irreversible breach of these terms. You thought the money was a gift, Breyer. It was a contract. And you just broke the most important line. You can't do this, she shrieked, her voice cracking as she tried to find her footing in the slippery ruins of the cake. It's already spent. You can't take back a degree from Yale. I didn't blink. I don't need to take back the degree, Breyer. I'm simply enforcing the financial clawback. Per the breach, the scholarship immediately converts into a high-interest private loan with a 0-day grace period. I've run the numbers. Including the compounded interest and the deferred Yale fees, I personally guaranteed as an officer of the trust. The total amount due to the Department of Education and the Helena Garrison Memorial Fund is $472,000. Clementine Sterling finally broke through the crowd, her face a frantic shade of crimson. "This is absurd, Thane. We'll fight this in every court in Florida. You can't just manufacture debt to punish my daughter." I looked at the woman who had spent the night sneering at my Kohl's suit. "What is the market value of an apology when the bill is $500,000? I asked her. "You can try to fight it, Clementine, but remember who drafted the very laws and contract precedents you're trying to cite. This document is airtight." I reached for my phone and placed a call, putting it on speakerphone so the entire room could hear. The weight of the fountain pen in my hand felt like a scepter of quiet justice. "Marcus, are you there?" I asked. A tinny, authoritative voice filled the ballroom. "Confirmed, Thane. I've been watching the live stream, and I just received the high-definition video, evidence of the assault provided by the wedding videographer. I am invoking the character clause for recipient B-STER-77, I said. "Do you have everything you need to proceed?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "The video is clear. We are processing the termination paperwork in real time as we speak. Per the acceleration clause, the debt will be officially reported to the federal database and the credit bureaus at midnight tonight, April 30th. The grace period ends at 11:59 p.m. The clock in the ballroom didn't just tick. It sounded like the heavy fall of a gavel over and over again. I watched as the color drained from Clementine's face, leaving her looking as hollow as the Sterling legacy. Briar remained in the ruins of her cake, her breath coming in sharp, shallow hitches. The smell of the ocean breeze coming through the terrace doors seemed to turn the room cold, or perhaps it was just the sudden realization that the Sterling brand was now a liability. $472,000, Briar, I repeated. Payable in full because you couldn't handle the sight of a man you considered beneath you. I saw Milo standing at the edge of the circle, his face a mask of profound, silent realization. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the woman he had almost tied his life to. The administrator's voice came over the speaker one last time. "There is one more detail, Thane. Recipient B-STER-77 already signed a conduct as affirmation just 2 hours before the wedding during her final check-in. This makes the assault a premeditated breach of contract. We are ready to file the lien." "Thank you, Marcus," I said, ending the call. The silence that followed was absolute. Briar collapsed into the buttercream ruins of her own ambition. But the sound of guests whispering wasn't about her debt. It was about the group of senior partners from her own law firm who were now walking toward us with their phones in hand. The circle of guests didn't just part for the 4 men in charcoal suits. It recoiled, sensing that the legal sharks of Sterling and Associates had smelled blood in the water, and for the first time, it wasn't mine. I stood perfectly still, my posture a rigid line of clinical detachment as I watched the high-tier legal team approach. Briar remained collapsed in the buttercream ruins of her own ambition, the red raspberry filling looking like a visceral wound against her white silk. She looked up, her eyes wide and wet, with a frantic, ragged sobbing, clearly hoping for a rescue that I knew was never coming. Everett Vance, the managing partner of Briar's firm, and a man whose legal reputation was as sharp and polished as his silver cufflinks, stepped into the light with the grim focus of a man performing surgery on his own firm. He didn't look at the cake or the ruined wedding. He looked at me with a nod of profound professional recognition. I had spent months ensuring he was invited as a guest of honor, a move he likely thought was a courtesy, but was actually the final placement of the gavel. Everett Vance cleared his throat, the sound like dry parchment rubbing together. "Ms. Sterling," he began, his voice cold and devoid of the camaraderie they had shared just hours ago. "Our firm does not retain attorneys who physically assault our most significant clients or anyone else for that matter. We represent the hospital system Mr. Garrison led for decades. Your behavior tonight is not just a personal failing, it is a professional catastrophe." Briar's mouth opened, a small choke sound escaping her lips. "Everett, please. It was a family matter." I was emotional. I wasn't thinking. He didn't flinch. "Precisely," he replied. "An attorney who stops thinking is a liability. Furthermore, our internal review was already flagging certain billing irregularities on the hospital's accounts under your supervision. This battery provides the necessary cause to move forward immediately. Your employment is terminated effective this second. A law degree is a privilege. A moral compass is a requirement." I watched the realization hit her, a physical blow that seemed to deflate her very soul. She wasn't just losing a job. She was losing the identity she had sacrificed her integrity to build. But the weight of the evening was only beginning to settle. Two other guests whom I recognized from the far side of the ballroom stepped forward. I knew their faces from the annual ethics convention's members of the Florida Bar's disciplinary committee. They stood beside Vance, their expressions mirrored in a shared professional disgust. Have you ever seen a person realize that the very people they were trying to impress are the ones who will ensure they never work again? It is a hollow kind of terror. Ms. Sterling, the taller of the two, said, his voice clipped. We have been witnesses to this entire sequence. Battery is a crime of moral turpitude, and we have already recorded the session. We will be filing a formal character and fitness report on Monday morning. I would suggest you find a very good defense attorney, though I suspect few in this room will take the call. Briar looked at her mother, but Clementine was staring at the floor, her own face a mask of ashen defeat. My life. She whispered the sound barely audible over the sharp, rhythmic tapping of a nearby guest's foot in the heavy silence. You're taking my entire life away. I fingered the thick cream-colored witness card Everett Vance was now holding out to me. The smell of cold, expensive wool and old paper from the men in suits was a stark contrast to the cloying, souring scent of the buttercream. Everett Vance turned to me, his expression shifting from clinical coldness to one of profound professional respect. Mr. Garrison, I've heard your name in our boardrooms for years, he said, his voice dropping to a tone of genuine apology. I only wish we'd met under circumstances that did your reputation more justice. You have my word that my firm will cooperate fully with any inquiry. I took the card, the weight of it in my hand, feeling like the final piece of a complex puzzle falling into place. Justice is a slow process, Mr. Vance. I replied, my voice steady and calm, but it usually finds its way to the right table eventually. The legal community was a jury that had already reached its verdict before Briar could even stand up from the floor. I felt the heavy cold marble through my thin dress socks, a grounding sensation that reminded me of the hospital corridors where Helena and I had spent our lives. The truth wasn't a weapon I had built. It was a foundation she had tried to build over, and tonight the ground had simply reclaimed its own. Everett Vance and his team turned and walked away, leaving Briar in the center of a circle that was no longer admiring, but repulsed. I looked at Milo, who was standing beside me, his eyes finally clear of the fog that had clouded them for years. He saw it all, the destruction of the facade, the clinical removal of a woman who had tried to buy her way into a legacy she never understood. Briar reached for Vance's sleeve as he passed her fingers, leaving a smear of raspberry filling on his expensive wool. But he didn't pull away. He simply looked at her with the same pity I'd seen the valet use on my Honda Civic. It was the look of a man seeing a discarded thing, a ghost of a career that had ended before the wedding cake was even cold. I adjusted my suit, feeling the finality of the moment settle over us like a shroud. The Sterlings were gone, the firm was gone, and the only thing left in the ballroom was the truth standing alone in the middle of the wreckage. I didn't wait for an apology from the wreckage on the floor. I simply turned my back on the Sterlings, the weight of 30 years of silence finally lifting from my shoulders as I signaled to the man in the gold-braided uniform. Briar had reached for Everett Vance's sleeve, her fingers leaving a smear of raspberry filling on his expensive wool. But he didn't pull away. He simply looked at her with the same pity I'd seen the valet use on my Honda Civic. I moved toward the perimeter of the ballroom, my steps echoing with a finality that felt like the closing of a long, arduous trial. Mr. Sterling, the hotel manager, whose name was an unfortunate coincidence he spent the next 10 minutes apologizing for, approached us with the stiff-backed gait of a man expecting a lawsuit. His face was a mask of profound corporate mortification, his brow damp under the opulent chandeliers. Mr. Garrison, the behavior witnessed tonight is a stain on our institution's history, he said, his voice trembling as he offered me a thick cream-colored envelope. We are processing a full reversal of all $36,000 in venue charges immediately. Here is my personal card. We will provide full cooperation and every second of security footage for any battery charges you wish to file. I took the envelope with a steady hand, feeling the eyes of the remaining guests, the ones who hadn't already fled the scandal, boring into my back. I looked at the manager, noting the frantic way his eyes darted toward the scene behind me. Don't send the check to me, Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice carrying that calm, mathematical precision that had always served me well. Send it to the West Palm Beach Domestic Violence Shelter. I want the donation made in the name of Helena Garrison. Let some good come out of this expensive tantrum. A refund can fix a bank account, but it can't scrub the shame off a marble floor. The manager nodded vigorously, clearly relieved that I wasn't demanding his resignation, along with the money. I surreptitiously tapped a button on my phone, ensuring that my recording of his offer was saved to the cloud. I had spent too many years in the legal department to trust a verbal agreement when $40,000 was on the line. I would ensure the donation wasn't misplaced by the hotel's accounting department later. Milo stepped up beside me, his grandfather's tuxedo sleeve still stained with a white smear of buttercream. I looked at my son, searching for any lingering regret for the world he had just watched burn. "You're not looking back, Milo?" I asked quietly. He looked toward the center of the room one last time. Briar and Clementine were left in a spotlight of their own making, a mother and daughter surrounded by ruined cake and the judgmental whispers of the very elite clusters they had sacrificed their integrity to join. "There's nothing left to see," Dad Milo replied, his voice firm and clear. "Just a lot of expensive frosting and empty promises. Have you ever noticed how the stars look brighter when you aren't trying to outshine everyone else under a chandelier?" As we walked toward the exit corridor, I felt a sense of quiet dignity. The invisible man at table 12 had effectively dismantled a dynasty just by standing up and speaking the truth. We passed the abandoned wedding ring glinting on the carpet like a discarded toy. The lobby air conditioning felt like a clean, cold baptism as we stepped out of the ballroom's stifling drama. We reached the valet stand where the same young man from our arrival was waiting. His posture, once slumping with disdain, was now rigid with a genuine, almost fearful respect. He held the door open for my 12-year-old Honda Civic as if it were a state limousine, his white-gloved hand lingering on the door handle. "Your car, Mr. Garrison," he whispered. It's a very reliable model, sir." I looked at the boy, then at the duct tape on my bumper. "Reliability is an underrated virtue, son. Remember that." I slid into the driver's seat, the familiar grit of the steering wheel's worn leather feeling more like home than any velvet chair in that hotel. The Honda Civic wasn't just a car anymore. It was a lifeboat carrying us away from a sinking ship of ego. As I turned the key, the mechanical rattle of the engine sounded like a victory march. I reached into the glove box and pulled out a heavy professional folder I had kept hidden there for months. I handed it to Milo as the salt air filled the cabin, the sound of the ocean waves crashing against the breaker's wall, providing the only soundtrack to our departure. "What's this?" Milo asked, his thumb tracing the embossed logo of the hospital system. "It's a job application," I said, pulling the Honda away from the gold-leafed gates that were now receding in the rearview mirror, for a lead position at the hospital's new pro bono legal wing. "I've been funding the startup costs secretly since Helena passed. They need someone who understands that the law is a tool for the people, not a weapon for the elite." Milo opened the folder, the cool, crisp paper catching the moonlight. He looked at the application, then at me, and his eyes stayed on my face for a long time. I knew that while tonight ended a marriage, it had finally begun a legacy that would last much longer than 6 months. The glitter of Palm Beach was a fading glow behind us as the Honda's engine hummed its steady, honest song, carrying us toward a future where the name Garrison finally meant exactly what Helena had always wanted it to mean. October in Florida doesn't bring a change of leaves, but it brought a change of atmosphere to my office, a clarity that only comes after the storm of a public scandal has finally settled into the quiet rhythm of justice. The humidity had finally broken, replaced by a crisp morning air that felt like a fresh start for the hospital system I had served for so long. I sat at my desk, the surface now clear of the frantic deposition, files, and malpractice records that had defined the spring. Instead, I was looking at an application for the Helena Garrison Memorial Fund. 6 months had passed since the night at the Breakers, and while the name Sterling was now whispered with derision in Palm Beach, the name Garrison had become synonymous with a different kind of currency. I looked up as a young man entered the room, his posture a spine as straight as a surgical needle and eyes that reflected the fierce work ethic of his grandmother. Elias, our newest scholarship recipient, sat across from me, followed by an older woman whose hands were mapped with the creases of 30 years of hard labor. She wore her Sunday best and a look of quiet triumph that no Sterling could ever hope to inherit. His grandmother, Mrs. Gable, had been a janitor at this very hospital for 3 decades, a woman I had greeted every morning without realizing she was the silent witness to my wife's final act of faith. Elias spoke of his dreams for pediatric surgery, with a humility that was almost jarring after a lifetime of dealing with Briar's brand of ambition. "Mr. Garrison," I promised to treat every patient with the dignity my grandmother showed this building for 30 years. He said, his voice steady and earnest. I looked at the boy, then at the woman beside him. Then you have already passed the most important exam of your career, Elias. I replied. I felt a surge of warmth and restoration. Have you ever noticed how the air smells cleaner once you have stopped trying to breathe in a room full of perfume lies? It is a visceral relief, a biological response to the absence of toxicity. I shared a secret with Elias that I hadn't even told Milo yet. Mrs. Gable was the specific janitor who had found Helena's missing locket in a trash bin years ago, after Breyer had presumably discarded it during a moment of panic. She had tried to return it, but Breyer had claimed she lost it elsewhere to cover her tracks. Mrs. Gable had kept it safe, eventually returning it to me after the wedding scandal broke. The locket was back where it belonged, but the person who had worn it was gone. After Elias and his grandmother left, I turned my attention to the stack of legal updates on my desk. The Sterling malpractice settlement was finally reaching its conclusion. The Patterson family had received their full award from the liquidated Sterling assets, and the bankruptcy fraud case against Clementine was moving toward a plea deal that would likely involve community service in the very wards she had once looked down upon. I looked at a stack of news clippings documenting Breyer's disbarment. The headline in the Florida Bar Journal was "Clinical Conduct Unbecoming." I felt no triumph as I read the words, only a sense of a completed ledger. The Sterling name was a brand. The Garrison name was a promise. I had spent 30 years balancing books and managing risks, but this was the first time the math of justice actually felt like it added up to zero. I stood up and moved to my home study later that evening. The orange glow of the fire reflected in the glass of Helena's portrait, making it look as though she were smiling at the closure I was about to provide. I found an old tucked-away photo of Breyer from her hospice volunteer days. In the picture, she was smiling beside Helena's bed, a masterclass in the performance of kindness. For a moment, I searched her young face for a sign of the person Helena believed in, but I only saw the seeds of the entitlement that eventually bloomed into cruelty. The flames in the fireplace didn't just consume the glossy paper of the photo. They cauterized a wound that had been festering since that night at the Breakers. I tossed the photo into the embers. I watched the edges curl and blacken the image of Breyer's fake smile dissolving into gray ash. "You were right about her heart, Helena," I whispered to the empty room. "You just didn't realize it had already turned to stone." I realized then that the fireplace I was using to burn the final remnant of that betrayal was built with the money I had saved by driving that old Honda Civic for 12 years. Practicality had provided the warmth for my wife's memory. The flames didn't just consume the glossy paper of the photo, they cauterized a wound that had been festering since that night at the Breakers. My phone buzzed on the mantel, a sharp vibration that broke the melancholy silence of the study. It was a message from Milo. He had been working at the pro bono wing for months now, and our relationship had moved from the wreckage of Palm Beach to a foundation of shared purpose. I picked up the phone, expecting a simple update about dinner or a question about a case file. But as I read the words on the screen, I realized his transformation was more radical than I had ever dared to hope. He wasn't just working the job I had funded, he was inhabiting it. He was finally finding the soul behind the case file that his mother had always talked about. I leaned back against the leather chair, the smell of wood smoke and old leather filling my lungs. The cycle of sacrifice and service was no longer a burden I carried alone. It was a legacy that was finally moving forward, carried by the son who had once been so desperate to leave it behind. As the last piece of the photo turned to ash, I prepared to read the details of my son's first major victory, knowing that the story of the Garrisons was just beginning a new honest chapter. My phone didn't just buzz. It felt like a heartbeat in my palm, and the text from Milo was the first time in 6 years I didn't have to read between the lines to find my son. The message was brief but glowing, with an energy I hadn't felt from him since he was a boy. "Dad, call me when you can." I think I just found what Mom was talking about. I didn't even wait to set down my coffee. I hit the dial button and listened to the rhythmic ring, my gaze fixed on the quiet autumn morning outside my window. When he picked up, his voice was thick with an excitement that billable hours could never buy. "Dad, we won," Milo said, and I could hear the genuine, unforced laughter of a man who had finally found his footing. The housing discrimination case. The corporate developer tried every trick in the book to evict that family of 5, but we held the line. I used the Helena Garrison logic, Dad. I stopped looking at the statutes as mere obstacles and started looking at the character of the people involved. We kept them in their home. I didn't bill a single hour for it, but I have never felt richer in my entire life. I close my eyes, a surge of pride warming my chest. Your mother would have said, "That is the only kind of interest that actually compounds Milo," I replied. You are finally practicing the kind of law that keeps the machine running without crushing the people inside. Have you ever heard the sound of a man finding his soul? It is not a choir or a symphony. It is just the quiet, steady tone of a son who is finally proud of his father. Milo went on to reveal a detail that made my professional instincts sharpen. The corporate developer he had just defeated was not a random entity. It was a shadow investment group that had been trying to bail out Clementine Sterling's bankrupt estate. By winning that case, Milo hadn't just saved a family. He had inadvertently pulled the final loose thread from the Sterling's financial shroud. We talked for an hour, the conversation flowing, with an ease that felt like a restoration of everything we had lost. He told me about Sarah, the high school history teacher he had been seeing for a few months. "She is the one, Dad," he confessed, his voice dropping to a softer, more reflective tone. "She treats the staff at the local diner with the same respect Breyer reserved for senior board members. She asked me today why I ever wanted a Rolex. I couldn't give her a reason that didn't sound like a lie. Time is the same, whether you track it on a gold watch or a plastic one, son," I said, looking at my own worn wrist. "It is how you spend it that counts. Billable hours are a prison. Justice is the key." I realized that Milo hadn't just found a partner. He had found a mirror that reflected the man Helena always hoped he would become. He described a Saturday afternoon they spent at a local park and how Sarah had challenged him to see the dignity in ordinary work, the kind of work that builds a community rather than just an ego. He was no longer running from our history. He was using it as a compass. Milo then told me something that brought a lump to my throat. He had moved into a small, modest office at the legal aid building, and the first thing he did was place a framed photo of Helena on his desk, the same photo Breyer had tried to erase from the wedding 6 months ago. Whenever I feel the pressure of a difficult case or the lure of an easier, higher-paying path, I look at her smile, Milo said. I remember the promise I made in the back of the Honda Civic. I sleep better now, Dad. I don't have to check my conscience at the door when I go to work. I felt a sense of profound closure, a mathematical certainty that the Garrison name was finally secure. "That is the best inheritance I could ever give you, Milo," I whispered. Milo wasn't just winning a case. He was performing an exorcism on the ghost of the man who thought Table 12 was a death sentence. He was finally standing in his own light, a light that didn't need a chandelier to shine. Just before we hung up, he mentioned that he had already started the paperwork for a legal name change. He was adding Helena's maiden name to his own, fully embracing the lineage he once tried to hide under designer labels. "It is a way to make sure she is on every brief I file," he explained. I sat in my office long after the call ended, the smell of fresh coffee brewing in the kitchen, a comforting domestic anchor. I looked at the heavy pro bono folder on my desk, the one I had finally moved to the closed pile. The math of our life was finally adding up. But as Milo hung up, he mentioned a viral article that was making its way through the national legal journals, and I realized that the story of Table 12 was no longer just our family's secret. It was about to become a movement. I reached for my laptop, my fingers steady as I opened the browser. I needed to see what the rest of the world was saying about the cost of character. The story was out, and I knew that once the truth started moving, there was no way to hide it back in the shadows. I leaned forward, the blue light of the screen reflecting in my eyes, ready to see the ripples of the stone we had dropped into the pond of Palm Beach. The cursor blinked on my screen like a steady pulse, hovering over a headline in the National Law Journal that had turned my private grief and a public cake assault into a mandatory curriculum for the next generation of attorneys. I sat in my office, the blue light of the laptop screen pressing against my tired eyes, reading the feature article titled "The Cost of Character, Re-Evaluating Philanthropic Contracts." It was a comprehensive landmark case study in medical and legal ethics that dissected the events at the breakers with the precision of a scalpel. The article focused heavily on how the character clause the FI had enforced protected Helena's legacy from being exploited by those who value status over service. It was surreal to realize that the quiet man from Table 12 was now the subject of debate in lecture halls from Yale to Stanford. I leaned back, a sense of awe and cosmic justice settling over me. I wondered if Breyer, in whatever windowless basement office she likely occupied, now knew that her greatest contribution to the law was becoming a cautionary tale. I scrolled through the comments section of the journal, seeing veteran attorneys and law students alike praising the integrity of the Helena Garrison Memorial Fund, The story had gone beyond viral. It had become a standard. If you think one person sitting in a corner cannot change the world, you have not seen what happens when the truth finally gets a microphone. I reached for a heavy leather-bound journal on my desk, my fingers tracing the grain as I opened a summary report from City National Bank. The numbers were staggering. There had been a 43% surge in philanthropic fund applications over the last 6 months. But it wasn't the money that made my hand tremble. It was the notes. 17 other families in South Florida had explicitly cited Helena's story as their inspiration for creating memorial scholarships with similar character requirements. My late wife's name was no longer just a memory etched on a headstone. It was a shield for dozens of students who might have otherwise been overlooked by the elite institutions that favored pedigree. Over grit, legacy is not what you leave for people. It is what you leave in them. I felt a wave of profound inspiration and expansive pride, realizing that the pebble I had dropped into a very still, very stagnant pond of elitism had created ripples that were finally reaching the shore. I stood up and moved toward the university hall, the smell of old books and floor wax greeting me as I entered the main corridor. The sound of enthusiastic young voices echoed off the high ceilings, a vibrant contrast to the clinical silence of the boardrooms I had inhabited for so long. I was there to meet the first cohort of students under the newly expanded charter. The fund now supported not just law and medicine, but nursing, social work, and teaching professions that the Sterlings would have labeled as essential support with a sneer. I walked into the hall and saw them 5 new students each coming from a background of struggle, standing in a semicircle with eyes that held the living proof that dignity cannot be inherited, only embodied. I shared a secret with them before we began the formal orientation. I told them that the anonymous journalist who broke the story and made it national was actually a former patient Helena had advocated for years ago. That man had spent a decade looking for a way to return the favor, and he did it by ensuring the truth about Table 12 was told to the world. One of the students, a young woman named Clara, who was entering the social work program, stepped forward with a hesitant smile. "Mr. Garrison, I have to tell you something," she said, her voice catching. "I was at the wedding. I was a server that night. I saw the cake assault from the service entrance. I decided that night to change my major to advocacy. I didn't want to just serve people like that anymore. I wanted to be the one who stood up to them." The revelation hit me with the force of a physical blow. The scholarship fund was a pebble dropped into a very still, very stagnant pond of elitism, and the ripples were finally reaching the shore. I looked at Clara, then at the other 4 faces. "This fund is not about your grades," I told them, my voice thick with emotion. "It is about how you treat the people who will never have the power to thank you. It is about the soul behind the case file." They nodded in unison, a diverse group of first-generation scholars whose presence filled the sterile hall with a vibrancy no amount of sterling gold leaf could ever replicate. "We understand, Mr. Garrison," one of them replied. "We will not let her down." I spent the next hour listening to their stories, feeling the weight of the leather journal in my hands as I noted their ambitions. I realized then that while I had been the one to set the trap for Briar, Helena had been the one who built the safety net for these children. As I looked at the 5 young faces in front of me, I realized there was one final seat at the table I needed to fill, the one that would bring this entire journey back to the very place where it almost ended. I walked out of the hall and into the cool October evening, the orange and purple sunset painting the Florida sky in colors that felt like a celebration. I knew exactly what I had to do. The final act was not about punishment. It was about the restoration of the table itself. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed a number I hadn't called in years, the savory scent of Helena's favorite recipe already beginning to form in my mind's eye. It was time to invite the right people to a meal that would finally taste like peace. The kitchen was thick with the scent of rosemary and slow-roasted chicken. Helena's Sunday recipe, a smell that didn't just fill the house, it anchored it to the only legacy that ever truly mattered. I stood by the stove, the familiar warmth pressing against my back, feeling a sense of domestic peace that Palm Beach could never have manufactured. 6 months after the wedding, that technically never happened, my home was no longer a quiet museum of the past. It was a workshop for the future. Milo was at the counter handling the carving, with the same meticulous focus he used at the legal aid office. Beside him was Sarah, Milo's wife, and a high school history teacher, with a laugh that could brighten even the darkest hospital corridor, moving through the kitchen with the ease of someone who truly belonged. Watching them, I realized that our family was finally whole without the need for the high-status performativity that had nearly dismantled us. "You know, Dad," Milo said, glancing up from the platter, I used to think the good life had a wait list. I thought I had to earn my way into certain rooms just to prove I existed. I didn't realize I just had to invite the right people to my own table. I offered him a small, knowing smile. The best tables are the ones where you don't have to check your soul at the door, Milo. A recipe is just a map, but a shared meal is the destination. We finished the preparations in a comfortable shared rhythm, the laughter of the two of them acting as a healing balm against the memory of the wedding's clinical judgmental silence. Milo spoke with pride about the future of the pro bono wing, and Sarah talked about her upcoming semester, her passion for her students reminding me so much of Helena's dedication to her patients. Later that evening, we moved from the house to a modest but warm local restaurant, where I had reserved a large circular table. I had personally requested a specific label for it, Table 1. As we sat down, I was joined by the 5 scholarship students I had met earlier at the university. They arrived with a mixture of nervousness and excitement, their eyes wide as they realized they weren't just receiving a check, but a seat at the Garrison family table. I looked at their diverse faces, the future doctors, lawyers, and social workers, and I shared a secret with them. I explained that this modest restaurant was actually owned by the family of the very first patient Helena ever helped as a nurse 40 years ago. They had never forgotten her, and I had never forgotten them. Gold leaf tastes like nothing. Character tastes like home. I looked at the 5 young scholars, then at Milo and Sarah. Tonight I began my voice steady and clear. We are not celebrating your degrees or your future billable hours. We are celebrating the fact that you chose to be the person my wife believed you could be. I explained to them the history of Table 12, not as a point of bitterness, but as a lesson in the architecture of respect. I wanted them to understand that for the rest of their careers, they would never be secondary family in my eyes or Helena's. One of the students, Elias, looked at the Table 1 card in its simple plastic holder, and then at me. "Thank you, Mr. Garrison," he whispered, "for seeing us." As the meal concluded, I stood to offer a final toast. I looked down at my hands, then at the table of people who would become my real legacy. I reflected on the $48 Kohl's suit and the $36,000 venue, concluding that true wealth is measured in the lives you improve, not the cars you lease. Respect is not where you sit at the table, it is how you treat the people sitting beside you. If you remember nothing else from this story, remember this. The quiet man in the corner is often the one holding the keys to the kingdom. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my wallet, looking at Helena's photo one last time before tucking it away. I knew her promise had been kept tenfold. Before we left, I leaned over to Milo and shared one final professional update. The pro bono legal wing he was leading had just received its first high-profile case. They were going to represent the victims of Breyer's former law firm in a class action suit regarding the very billing irregularities Everett Vance had mentioned. The cycle of justice was coming full circle, and my son was the one leading the charge. As we walked out into the cool October night, the Atlantic breeze carried a hint of salt and promise. I caught a glimpse of a rusted 12-year-old Honda Civic in the parking lot. It wasn't mine, it belonged to one of the students, but seeing it there felt like a benediction. I realized then that the cycle of sacrifice and service was just beginning for a whole new generation. The Sterlings were a fading memory, a cautionary tale of what happens when you build a house on the sand of ego. But here under the Florida stars, the foundation was made of something much stronger than gold. I climbed into my own car, the engine rattling with its familiar honest cough. Milo and Sarah waved as they pulled away in their own modest sedan, heading toward a life built on truth. I sat for a moment in the silence, feeling the weight of 30 years finally settle into a profound, uncomplicated peace. The math of my life had finally added up, and for the first time since Helena passed, the balance sheet was perfectly clear. I turned the key, and as I drove away from the restaurant, I knew that the name Garrison would never be erased from the history that actually mattered. The lesson was complete, and the table was finally full. I walked out of that ballroom with cake still on my jacket and something far heavier on my mind clarity. This wasn't just a victory, it was a warning I should have listened to years ago. I told myself I was being patient, strategic, but the truth is, I tolerated disrespect for too long. That's how family betrayal begins, quietly, slowly, until it feels normal. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: don't shrink yourself to keep the peace. Don't stay silent just to be accepted by people who only value you when it benefits them. A family story should never be built on fear, control, or illusion. And if you ever feel like you have to hide who you are to belong, then you're already in the wrong place. I thank God I saw the truth before it was too late, because not every family story gets a second chance, and not everyone walks away from family betrayal with their dignity intact. So learn from me, set boundaries early. Protect your name, your values, and your peace. Because once family betrayal crosses a line, it doesn't just break trust, it rewrites the entire family's story. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. Share your thoughts below. What would you do if you were in my position facing that kind of betrayal? I truly want to hear your perspective. If this story moved, you consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. Just a quick note, while inspired by real-life themes, some elements have been dramatized for storytelling. If this kind of content isn't for you, feel free to explore other videos that better match your interests.